For that situation,
Yes.
you change your mind.
Findings of fact.
I now call a special meeting of the council to order. All please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Councilmember Shepherd, can you please lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
City Clerk, please take the roll call.
Councilmember James.
Here.
Councilmember Ross.
Here.
Councilmember Holloway.
Here.
Councilmember Mayhew.
Here.
Councilmember Lassay.
Here.
Councilmember Sundwall.
Here.
Councilmember Shepherd.
Here.
Mayor Larson.
I am here. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to the city attorney to explain the quasi-judicial and closed hearing aspects of what we're doing here tonight and make sure we get off to a good start. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And for those who don't know me, I'm Bob Sturbank. I'm the city attorney. As you probably know, this matter in front of the council involves the appeal of a project permit, specifically a conditional use permit for the, or referred to in the record as a CUP by its acronym, for the Panorama Apartments Affordable Housing Project. And under Washington appellate court decisions, this kind of proceeding is a quasi-judicial land use matter, and under the city code, it's categorized as a Category 4 project permit, which means it had an open record hearing in front of the hearing examiner and now has a closed record appeal in front of the city council. So I want to talk for a moment about what it means to say it's, quotes, quasi-judicial and, quote, closed record appeal. So quasi-judicial comes both from the case law and the statute. The current definition is laid out in RCW 4236010. And it says, quote, quasi-judicial actions of a local decision-making bodies are those actions of the legislative body, in this case the city council, which determines the legal rights, duties, or privileges of specific parties in a hearing or other contested case. And because the decision of the council will determine the specific rights, duties, and privileges of the applicant with respect to what it can develop on its property, on parcel S20, and because it determines the specific rights and privileges of the appellants who have contested the development proposal, that makes this a quasi-judicial proceeding in front of the city council. And it's in contrast to when the council acts in its legislative capacity, when it considers policies or other matters, laws or regulations with general application citywide. For example, when the council adopts utility rates or decides to issue municipal bonds to fund city projects or sets the speed limit on SR 202 or the Parkway, those are legislative decisions, in contrast to this specific decision on a specific parcel of property resolving the contest between the applicant's application and the appellant's appeal. So what does it mean when it's quasi-judicial? That means that instead of the council considering its policy preferences and politics and how many in favor and how many against, as it would in a legislative matter, the council has to apply the specific laws and regulations in the city code to the evidence in the record that was made in front of the hearing examiner. And it may not consider the politics or whether it's supported by the majority or opposed by the majority of the people in the room or elsewhere. And then in this case, the city code, and specifically it's section 14.40.030, requires that the city council shall affirm the decision and findings of the hearing examiner unless the city council shall find such finding and decision to be clearly erroneous. And clearly erroneous, and again I'll use the air quotations, has a specific legal meaning in Washington appellate jurisprudence. And what that means is that the hearing examiner's decision must be affirmed unless, and I'll quote again from the cases, after reviewing the record as a whole, the city council is left with the definite and firm conviction that a mistake has been made, unquote. And this is known as a heightened standard of review. It's more than just there's a scintilla of evidence that tips the balance one way or the other, but based on the record as a whole, the council has to be very clear that a mistake was made in order not to affirm the decision in front of it. In addition, the appearance of fairness doctrine applies to quasi-judicial land use matters. I'll talk about that more in just a second. Closed record appeal, I mentioned, that means, according to, again, to the city code, that the appeal shall be heard on the basis of the record before the hearing examiner, provided that additional oral testimony or exhibits may be received by stipulation. That would mean the agreement of all the parties present, or only if required in the discretion of the city council to clarify or supplement the record. That's a pretty limited set of circumstances, and so absent that, the council bases its decision on the record that was compiled in front of the hearing examiner. And it also means, as they probably saw from the special meeting notice for tonight's meeting, that the council will not be accepting comment from the general public or even from members of the public who may have appeared in front of the hearing examiner unless those individuals specifically filed appeals. And in this case, those are the appellants, Ms. Fletcher, Mr. Babcock, and then city staff and the applicant. Those are the only individuals who will be presenting argument to the council. Now, I mentioned the appearance of fairness doctrine, and I'll try to go through this quickly. This is a doctrine that evolved in Washington through judicial opinions. It's now codified in Chapter 42.36 of the Washington Revised Code in the state statutes. And it's designed to ensure that a proceeding like this, a quasi-judicial matter, is fair and also appears fair. And so in general, it prohibits ex parte or off-the-record communications between members of the council and opponents or proponents of the project, unless the substance of those communications are put on the record tonight and the parties and afforded an opportunity to rebut the substance one way or the other. And I'm going to poll council members in a moment about that. So for example, if a council member encountered a member of the public at the grocery store and that person wanted to express their views and advocate one way or the other, that's an ex parte or off the record communication. Same would be true if council members receive phone calls, phone messages, emails. And so if they have, and as I said, I'll ask council members in a moment, they should disclose and place the substance of those communications on the record, and then we would then allow the parties an opportunity to object and or rebut the substance of those communications. And there are other sort of more general concerns about partiality or bias that the appearance of fairness doctrine is aimed at. And so absent the disclosure, or if there are those evidence of that type of partiality or bias, then the appearance of fairness doctrine calls for a council member to recuse him or herself and to leave the room and not to participate in any way in the proceedings. So I'm going to turn now to the set of questions to the council members. I'll ask the question and then poll council members individually one by one. So the first question is, do you have any interest in any of the property that is the subject of the proceeding? For example, do you own any interest in parcel S20 or any shares in the applicant company? Or do you have any interest, say, a contract to purchase property from one of the appellants? Councilmember Jeans?
No.
Councilmember Ross?
No.
Councilmember Holloway?
No.
Councilmember Mayhew?
No.
Councilmember Lassay?
No.
Councilmember Sundwall?
No.
Councilmember Shepherd?
No.
The next question is whether you stand to gain or lose by virtue of your decision on the project. For example, is your property located so close to the project that you believe its value would be materially increased or decreased by the project? Or are you employed by or have any prospective employment with any of the parties to the proceeding, or have any other relationships that would materially affect your ability to impartially decide? Councilmember Jeans?
No.
Councilmember Ross?
No.
Councilmember Holloway?
No.
Councilmember Mayhew?
No.
Councilmember Lassay?
No.
Councilmember Sundwall?
Not sure. So I do know one of the appellants fairly personally, but I do not believe that would impact my ability to decide one way or the other.
Can you be more specific about that?
So I know Mrs. Fletcher. We've been family friends for a while. Our daughters are among best friends, but we don't have, I don't find that to be a conflict per se.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Shepherd?
No.
Is there any other reason that you believe that you might not be able to impartially decide this matter? Did you participate in the previous proceeding? Have you announced a clear position one way or the other on the project in the past? Councilmember Jeans?
No.
Councilmember Ross?
No.
Councilmember Holloway?
No.
Councilmember Mayhew?
No.
Councilmember Lassay?
As a member of the Planning Commission, does that fall into that category?
The statute specifically allows, well, the Planning Commission didn't make a recommendation on this project.
No, we did not.
which-
But we did review a zoning change or a.
Councilmember, say if you
believe-
pull your microphone closer, please.
Sorry. I believe there was a zoning change sometime in the last couple of years, but I believe it was the previous applicant with which it was discussed. So I don't think that has any impact, but I want to make sure.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Sundwall?
Can you ask the question again? Sorry.
Whether there was any other reason that you believed that you could not impartially decide the matter, whether you would.
So I guess the only thing I would say, and this is on the record, is that I was the head of the CDC committee that signed off along with Mark Hoffman. So I don't think that puts me, I mean, someone had to sign off, and it was my job to do it, so.
That was, you're referring to signing off on the wall height waiver and the.
Oh, that's the wall
minor
height. Yeah, you're right.
modification.
So that's not part of,
Just the minor modification.
just
not
minor,
the
so
wall
that
height
has no bearing. Yeah, correct.
That was not part of the
Yeah,
conditional use permit
correct. Sorry, I was
decision. Okay.
confused.
Councilmember Shepherd?
Yes.
Okay, can you?
I
elaborate?
testified at the hearing that they had for this issue.
Okay, and so, yes,
I'm recusing myself.
you, okay, all right, thank you.
Yes. Do I leave now?
Sure.
Well, if I could clarify, I mean, testifying alone doesn't necessarily recuse, but if there was a strong opinion or an opinion that was provided during that testimony that I assume, Councilmember Shepherd, you're saying would compromise your position, is that I assume is why you're recusing yourself?
Do you want me to share my opinion, or?
Well,
What's-
just a
what's
clarification, I
wrong?
mean, for folks to understand, in other words, testifying because it's on the
She
record.
doesn't, but testifying, Mayor, now as a decision maker, she would be in a position of having to judge the value of her own testimony as against other evidence, and that's, I think, just.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
And just for the public understands, it was in the middle of the election, and Peggy hadn't known if she was going to be a council member yet when she gave her testimony, so she wasn't necessarily being careless about it.
Yeah, so it would be appropriate now if you're recusing
Okay,
yourself.
thank you.
And the last question for council members is, have you had any oral or ex parte written communications with any opponents or proponents of the project? So that would be any opponents or proponents, not just necessarily these appellants or the applicant. Councilmember.
Can you repeat that again?
Have you had any oral or written ex parte or off-the-record communications with any opponents or proponents of the project? Councilmember Jeans?
Yes. Before this meeting started, I saw Ann Gigi in the lobby, and I asked her if she would clarify the difference between Panorama Apartments and Devco, because I didn't see Devco identified in pretty much the record that we reviewed. And she gave me a sort of a one-sentence answer. I don't think it affects what I did. I shouldn't have asked it, but I didn't realize that, so that's my only contact with anybody.
Are you able to explain briefly what the answer was?
Devco is behind Panorama Apartments, but Panorama LLC is the applicant, is the party that we're dealing with. That's what I learned.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll start with the appellants. Do they wish to rebut the substance of what Mr. Jeans was told? For the record, Ms. Fletcher's shaking her head. Mr. Babcock is also. Ms. Gigi, do you have anything to rebut or add to or not add to, but rebut the substance?
No, I just clarified that Panorama Apartments LLC is a special purpose entity for the development of the Panorama Apartments.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Ross, any ex parte communications?
This
Sorry, back to
question
the original question.
No, no.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Holloway?
No.
Councilmember Mayhew?
No.
Councilmember Lassay?
Yes, I was approached by a former resident of a neighborhood nearby where Panorama Apartments, asking if the decision has been made to develop the apartments or not. I said no decision has been made, and there is a hearing coming up. That was the extent of, and then that was the extent of it, and I ended the conversation at that point.
Okay. I'll offer an opportunity to rebut. I don't know that for the record, everyone's shaking their head no, that they don't wish to try to rebut as far as the applicant or the appellants. Councilmember Sundwall?
So yes, I'll be I'm a little fuzzy on the timing on this, but and Holly can maybe help me out on this, but I believe in the November timeframe, we gathered together for a holiday type family gathering at my sister's home here in Snoqualmie. Game night, I guess you could call it, and learned some new rules of Settlers of Catan that we now implement in our family. But among many topics that came up, I do seem to recall this topic came up. I don't recall that it necessarily had to do with the CUP, the very narrow CUP that we're deciding, but I would, if Holly had a different recollection, I would accept that.
I don't recall specifically talking about the CUP. That had been, yeah, and Mr. Sandwell would have no problem
Yeah,
telling
or Holly, if you could just stop for a second, just point order. I want to make sure we have to capture this all on the record, and I see you don't have, so we're going to get a microphone for you guys. Sorry to interrupt you.
I don't recall specifically talking about the CUP, and I don't feel that the conversations that Mr. Sundwell and I had would make him biased in any regard. He'd have no problem telling me he disagreed with me, and I'd have no problem doing the same to him. So.
Okay, thank you. And anything, the other parties, the applicant behind you is, your client is shaking his, all right, and Ms. Giggy is okay, Ms. Pratt says all right as well. All right, that concludes my discussion of quasi-judicial and the appearance of fairness, other than just to ask any of the parties, based on the answers from the council that you've heard, does any party wish to challenge the continued participation of any individual council member? I'm seeing no from Ms. Pratt for the city staff, no from the applicant, and no from each of the appellants. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, council members. I'll turn it back now to the mayor.
All right, thank you, Bob. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Community Development Director to give a quick review of the project itself.
Good evening. Mark Hoffman, Community Development Director, City of Snoqualmie. I'm going to start with two things. This introduction is a broad overview so that we can get to the appellants, of which there are two, the applicant and a city attorney representative to do their thing. So I'd ask that in this broad overview, reserve any essential questions till later or deliberation, unless it's an emergency question. But to get started and give that overview. The second thing is that Chris Beralin is scheduled to be here, fair and peers, to discuss the portion of any of the record, the existing record that may come up tonight. He's running a little late, but did email that he's on his way. So to begin with, there we go. As you all may well know, Snoqualmie Ridge 2 is three parts. You have the northeast section, the northern section, and Snoqualmie Ridge 2 south. They surround Snoqualmie Ridge 1, which is the earlier master planned community. Tonight we're going to be discussing generally Snoqualmie Ridge south, SR2 south. More specifically, the project site, which is known as S20 by staff. So you see in the documents that the parcel number and the location off of Frontier and Jacobian Parkway above the hospital. This last exhibit map is from the environmental impact statement, which identifies the access of S20 off of Frontier.
Mark, would you mind grabbing the microphone so you could hold it a little closer to your mouth? I think it would pick it up a little better.
hello. So S20, as envisioned in the EIS, comes off of Parkway, Jacobia, Frontier, and it's this arrow is the access to the site. And this is in 2003. The hospital and the undeveloped portion of S21 are below it, and the project site is S20. Some key dates. The draft environmental impact statement is dated June 2nd, 2003. The final is dated February 23rd, 2004. The development agreement for SR2 is dated June 28th, 2004. And the mixed-use final plan, or MUFP, is dated August 9th, 2004. That takes us up to the actual general land use application from DevCo for Panorama Apartments, dated May 25th, 2017. There's a lot of history in between, consolidation, a lot of resolutions that are in the record of the hearing examiner, so I won't go into that detail. This next series of exhibits is just to give a general idea of the application materials, what the project design is. These are included in the PowerPoint, not so much to be read. Even when you blow them up in the PowerPoint, they're hard to read, but we have them in paper form, and we also have them in PDF form for later discussion if you want to get into any of the notes on here. Essentially, this is the architectural site plan showing 11 buildings accessed off the terminus of Frontier, and then a circuitous ADA-compliant parking and access area leading down to the bottom of the site. From there through to the hospital is constrained to be emergency ingress and egress only, not through traffic of Frontier. This architectural site plan also shows the locations of the 11 buildings. The one that the laser is on right now is the 2-story recreation building. The 10 other buildings are residential apartment multifamily.
Mark?
Yes, sir.
Wait, go back.
This is similar.
Wait,
The building's overlaid.
Mark,
This is
Mark,
the
Mark,
this is
Mark,
the conceptual.
I got a question on the last slide.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Holloway, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. So which are the buildings that have the extra stories?
The conditional use permit is specific to 5 of these 11 buildings. And I don't have the identifier in my mind, but essentially it's these 4 lower buildings, lower in topography, and this building down here. To go through them, these are 3 3-story carriage structures, apartment buildings that appear from, and you'll see in the sections later on, I'll go through that. These are 3-story, this is 4, this is 4, this is 4, this is 4, this is 4. Those are the 5 CUP subject buildings. The 2-story rec is not. The conceptual grading plan has the numbers corresponding. Essentially what it shows, and you can't read it from the slide, is that from property line to property line it drops about 100 feet. The upper portion up here, the lower portion down below. It's an average grade of 14% across the site. This is a conceptual perspective from where the cul-de-sac ending of Frontier would be. Essentially the entry area off of Frontier. I have 3 cross sections for you across the site. These first 2 are explained by this diagram here. So I'm calling this top one the westernmost. It starts from the first of the carriage, 3-story carriage units, cuts across 2 of the 4-story buildings. So you see the higher to lower and the change in elevation. This second cross section is in the middle of the site from the 3rd carriage unit building through the gap in between, through a 4-story building to the other edge of the site. Again, it shows the topography from higher to lower. This 3rd cross section is slightly southeast of center, but again starts uphill where there are no 3-story carriage units through the larger buildings as shown. Collectively, the 3 sections show the sloping topography of the site.
Mark, could you go back to the overall plan real quick just to orient myself again? Okay, thank you. Got it.
That answers it?
Now I'm at. Yep.
After the sections, I have the typical elevations that are proposed. This first sheet of the application materials shows the carriage units uphill. Whoop, there we go, laser. The inward facing along the access ADA driveway has the garage faces. And you can see in this area right here where the laser is, the retaining wall that is about 1.5 stories, almost 2 stories, whereas the Eagle Point neighborhood is up above. So this is downward sloping on the northern portion of the site. Retaining wall by separate action was the retaining wall height waiver to exceed 6 feet. This is an example of one of those walls, but it's not part of the conditional use permit action.
And that wall is reflected in the elevation charts you showed prior?
That's correct. The uphill property line is roughly in this area where the laser is right now, above the wall with a small area in between for landscaping. These are in between those carriage units and separate the smaller units from the conditional use permit 4th-story elements. These are 3 stories in nature. 3, 4, 5, which there are 2 of them, if I get my math right. But more pertinent to
Or Mark,
tonight.
if you could go back, please.
Mhm.
So in the 2 center schematics, you see the retaining walls again. And so effectively from the uphill side, I understand that it appears like a 2-story building because you don't see the lower story from uphill.
Yes, this retaining wall would be on the uphill side of the 3-story. The carriage home would be uphill of that. So this is a second
All right, thank you.
retaining wall
Thank
in
you.
the middle of the site,
Thank you.
essentially between the 3 stories and the 2 stories. More pertinent to tonight are the 4-story elevations, of which there are 5. This is the typical elevation. And you'll again see the retaining wall, third layer, and then the downhill side that's not shown on here is on the grading plan. There are some larger walls on the downhill side of the of 2 of the 4 stories.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
So,
Councilmember Ross?
thank you. So it's 4-story. What's the overall foot, though? Is it 60 foot or is it less?
The conditional use permit does not have a footage. So for instance, in the hotel example or downtown with the Snoqualmie Municipal Code, there's a height limit.
Right.
This does not have that. With a conditional use permit, you can build a 4th or 5th story element, 1 or 2 or 3 stories by right, or if you propose a 4th or 5th story, there is a finding in there that you can get that through the issuance based on issuance of a conditional use permit based on the topography of the site. There is no corresponding number associated with that, and there are no multifamily residential design standards for Snoqualmie Ridge 2. So in granting, and I'll go further, there's another step after conditional use permit, which is called mixed use consistency review. That's where those, any related development standards would come into play. But for the purposes of the conditional use permit, the issuance and the findings and the appeal are not based on a number. It's based on the 4th-story element and how it relates to the site's topography. The key data points are the 14% average slope and the 100-foot drop. The buildings correspondingly would look like this, of which in the sections you'll see that they have pitched slope roofs. And so what this isn't, conditional use permit, is not mixed use consistency review, nor is it a building permit. But for this level, the finding is just 4th-story element. Some more key dates that are also in the record are based on that the conditional use permit request for Panorama is specific to 5 of the 11 total proposed buildings. That's what's before you tonight. The hearing examiner held a public hearing on November 8th and 16th, 2017, in which case comment and testimony were taken. The hearing examiner took almost 2 months to issue his decision, which was 2 parts. One is not relevant tonight, and that is the denial of an appeal for the minor use, or for the minor modification for clarifying density, and the administrative decision on wall height waiver to exceed 6 feet. That was in his action. The third part of his action was approval, his approval of a conditional use permit. That was dated January 23rd, 2018. Once we received and reviewed that, we published and noticed a notice of decision, February 2nd. 2 appeals, one by Holly Fletcher and one by Adam Babcock, were timely filed with the city. And those 2 appeals are what you will be hearing tonight. And so with that, we will go to the next step. Thank you.
So on to the arguments. The parties to appeal will make oral arguments based only on the record. And I ask that it would be helpful for both the city attorney, our community development director, or any of the parties here tonight, if you feel something is wandering off of what's based only on the record, that you can just say point of order or an objection and bring that to my attention. I can address that and make a determination and get us back on track. Parties shall refrain from referring to evidence or matters outside the record. If council members have questions, they should get my attention, so I make sure all council members have an equal opportunity to ask questions that they may have. Each party is allocated 20 minutes for arguments that they may have. Each party is allocated 20 minutes for arguments. The applicants get an opportunity for rebuttal within their total time allotment. So each of you will get 20 minutes, and in a moment I'll ask you to determine how much you want to reserve for your initial statements and then for rebuttal. Members of the audience shall refrain from clapping, cheering, booing, or hissing, or otherwise making noises or gestures in favor or opposition to one side or the other. This is necessary to ensure a fair procedure for all parties. Members of the audience should conduct themselves with a decorum expected in a courtroom. Anyone engaging in improper behavior would be asked to leave. What I'll usually do is start with just doing a short recess, and if temperatures don't cool, then Chief Perry would be happy to have a conversation with you out in the lobby or on the front deck. We will proceed in the following order. We'll open with applicant Holly Fletcher. Holly, how much time, I'm sorry, we'll just go through. We'll start with Holly Fletcher. We'll go to Mr. Babcock, to you, and then a response from Ann Giggy and or Andy Murphy, applicant representing the Panorama Apartments, and then a response from Kim Pratt from Kenyon Deason, who's representing the city or the hearing examiner's position, or defending the hearing examiner's decision, and then a time for, again, rebuttal from Ms. Fletcher and from Mr. Babcock. So Holly, starting with you, how much time do you want to reserve for a rebuttal?
Let's say 7, if we don't use all the time for the initial argument.
Okay, so we'll set you for 13 minutes right now, and you can begin.
All right, Mayor, just to clarify for the record, Ms. Pratt represented city staff in front of the examiner and is here presenting staff position because this is quasi-judicial, and I'm representing the council and providing the council legal legal advice. We felt it appropriate to keep those things separate.
All right, thank you for the clarification. Sure. We didn't start your timer yet, Ms. Fletcher.
Okay, I got it right here. Okay.
More comfortable with the handheld mic.
Nope, this is fine as long as you can hear me.
Yep.
Does that work? Okay.
Thank you.
I understand that affordable housing is needed and that S20 is slated to fulfill that need, but the scale of this proposed complex is beyond what has been expected and what is required. Panorama's proposal is the wrong fit for this particular parcel of land. The city of Snoqualmie isn't in the position to absorb the increased traffic and student population that something of this scale will generate. Each request to increase the scale of this project compounds the issues that we will be required to face. We have the ability to shape development on S20 into something that meets the needs of the city and its residents without further intensifying the issues we are already facing. In the city's advisory report to the hearing examiner, it states that the CUP process provides opportunity for review of proposed building heights and design for compatibility of scale and character with uses adjacent to parcel S20. Panorama's proposed development does not fit the character and scale of our city, and I urge the council to reduce the scale of the development into something better suited for our community by denying the applicant's request to include 4-story buildings. The approval of the CUP would further increase the scale of the project by allowing Panorama to increase the number of stories set forth in the development agreement from 3 stories to 4 stories. The proposed development is inconsistent. Approval of the CUP would allow Panorama the additional square footage to proceed with their intent to include 4 and 5 bedroom units, which is contrary to the development agreement in Resolution 712, which is Exhibit 1F7C, which states 12, which is Exhibit 1F7C, which states that affordable housing rental units may include studio, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units, which shall be priced for 1-person, 2-person, 3-person, and 4-person households respectively. Panorama's requests are repeatedly pushing us beyond the limits set forth and beyond what we should accept. There continues to be a misunderstanding and a misrepresentation of the number of units needed to fulfill low-income housing obligations held by our city. There are 184 housing credits outstanding. This does not equate to 184 units outstanding. At 60% AMI, the 184 credit obligations can be fulfilled with as few as 122 units, because each unit at 60% AMI fulfills 1.5 credits. I think this is an important point to make because I believe it's been misrepresented and not acknowledged through this process. With the approval of 191 units, we've already far exceeded the limits beyond what is necessary and beyond what is required. Additional requests will just compound the issues. It cannot be ignored that the builder intends on including 4 and 5 bedroom units, which is excessive and unnecessary. In Resolution 702, Attachment G, and Resolution 712, it states that affordable housing rental units may include studio 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. Panorama's intention to build 4 and 5 bedroom units does not comply with the development agreement and as a result should not be allowed. The size of the units directly impacts the scale of the streets and highways and the number of children in our schools. It's an important factor that should not be ignored. 4 and 5 bedroom units are not the standard in affordable housing developments. The target for affordable to 3 bedrooms. 78% of the projects across the U.S. are under 100 units in number, so we're already twice that size. And only 3% include units over 3 bedrooms. The concerns brought up regarding the size of the units has essentially been ignored in the documentation, Panorama, and the hearing examiner, and seems to be purposely brushed. The concerns brought up regarding the size of the units has essentially been ignored in the documentation, Panorama, and the hearing examiner, and seems to be purposely brushed over. I have found it to be a significant area of concern when residents are informed of its inclusion. Unit size during the notification process, and the only way to know of its inclusion would be to read through the developer application. David Ratliff testified beginning at 33 minutes, 19 seconds, that if the CUP was denied, that the result would be units of smaller size. If we limit the size of these units, we will decrease the footprint, the height, the scale, environmental impacts. Traffic repercussions would be reduced and the burden on our schools lessened. Each request to increase the scope of this project compounds the issues. The estimated traffic reports suggested by the witnesses, this is Exhibit 4 and 5 of the appeal, don't add up to the realities we face. Our own mayor has stated that traffic is the biggest inhibitor to the success of our city. That's in Appeal Exhibit 1, page 2. However, according to witness testimony, traffic isn't an item of concern. As citizens that face these issues on a daily basis, we agree with our mayor. Traffic is a major issue now and will assuredly worsen with the proposed development. It was stated at the hearing that the traffic studies did not take into consideration the size of the units when evaluating traffic implications. Again, this is unacceptable. A 5-bedroom unit will have more persons than a 1 or 2 bedroom unit. In the testimony given by Chris Brayland, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, this is 3 hours, 13 minutes in, he acknowledged multiple times, and I quote, "A larger unit will generate additional trips." However, that was not included in the traffic analyses or the estimates that we are being asked to rely on. Given the additional square footage offered in a 5-bedroom unit, we will likely see extended families and/or multiple families occupying the same unit, thus creating a further increase in additional traffic issues for our city. Traffic has significantly worsened since the traffic studies and requires further independent analysis. Much of the congestion at the I-90 Highway 18 interchange is due to growth in the Maple Valley and Covington areas. Often commuters heading east on 90 will turn left onto the Parkway to avoid the mile-long backup on I-90, travel up the Parkway to Jacobia or Swenson, and turn around to head west on Highway 18. This causes further stress on our local streets. Often the backup extends so far up the Parkway that access to Jacobia, which is the entrance road into this neighborhood, is inaccessible. A development of this scale, located so closely to one of the most dangerous and congested intersections in our state, is unwise. The dangers and traffic issues of I-90 and Highway 18 were ignored in the traffic analysis. In addition, the traffic analyses did not take into consideration the limited or lack of public transportation in the area. Mike Reed shared an example during his testimony, this was about 57 minutes in, of 3 developments in Federal Way that he used to support the argument that low-income housing developments had less trip generation than standard. However, through questioning, it was also learned that these comparisons failed to recognize that the Federal Way examples are located in close proximity to what the hearing examiner termed as some of the best transit in King County. None of the traffic analyses have taken into consideration the lack of public transportation or the large unit size as previously discussed available near S20, and as a result, we cannot expect to see the lower traffic implications the applicant is suggesting. We discovered during the hearing examination that the school district was not directly notified of the proposed development. The city has justified this by stating that the school district is aware of the potential increase of students at full build-out of SR2, which would include development on S20. However, the size of the proposed units again is ignored. This information would be essential to the school district in order to forecast and evaluate the impacts and burdens this will have on our schools and determine if we can accommodate the increase in student population. The schools in the area are already over capacity. We lack the transportation resources to bus students to less crowded schools in Fall City and North Bend. The school district is not prepared to absorb the influx of students a housing complex of this size will generate. The increase in student population that the city is estimating at 23 to 24 students per 100 units is seriously understated when the builder is intending on building 4 and 5 bedroom units. Units above the standard of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms will bring in substantially more students than estimated. The size of the units needs to be given significant consideration. Panorama's proposed development does not comply with the conditional use permit criteria. The scale of Panorama's proposed development is not comparable to what exists in our area. Appeal Exhibit 1, page 4, contains statistics regarding other affordable housing developments within Snoqualmie. The 2 nearest apartment complexes, the Woodlands on Swenson, Echo Ridge on Kinsey, are both limited to 3-bedroom units, and they do not include buildings in excess of 3 stories high. The proposed development is inconsistent with surrounding properties. The city justifies recent approvals stating that the maximum density limits for greater SR2 community will not be exceeded with the proposed increases in scale on S20. However, I would urge that we take a more conservative approach due to the current issues we're facing as a city and the fact that 68% of residents feel that the speed of population growth is too fast. This is Appeal Exhibit 1, page 1. Just because the limits were not exceeded in one area does not suggest we should exceed the limits in another area, especially considering the location and limitations of this particular parcel. In addition, an additional criteria used to evaluate the approval of a CUP is that all measures should be taken to minimize the possible adverse impacts which the proposed use may have on an area to which it's located. I urge the City Council to reduce the scale of the development in order to minimize the adverse impacts the proposed development will have on our streets and our schools. Snoqualmie is a unique and amazing place to live. That's why it makes it on the top of so many lists of best places to live. Our small town cannot be expected to be able to absorb a large development typically seen in cities like Bellevue and Federal Way, cities that are already prepared with existing infrastructure to absorb that growth and that community. I hope that through this evaluation process, those who live here and represent the citizens of our city will carefully consider the impacts of the proposed development. It's my desire that we can maintain some control over the development that we allow and find a more balanced way to integrate affordable housing into our community at a scale we can handle. That's all I have for now. I'll save those 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Fletcher. Before we proceed, as a matter of protocol, is she able to reserve, she's got 2 minutes, is she able to reserve that?
Sure.
Okay. So I'll add an additional 2 minutes to your rebuttal if you'd like. That would give you a total of 9 minutes for rebuttal. Mr. Babcock, how much time did you want for? And again, you won't be penalized if you guess incorrectly, so. 13, okay. Very good. Yes, you are. No, if you could come up, please.
Is there water available for us?
We'll get some for you, yeah.
Okay.
Clean up mine.
I got
Mostly gone, but
You don't give them an open one, Sean.
Okay, hang on a second. Jody, can you reset that real quick? Okay, please continue, Mr. Babcock.
Okay, does Mark Hoffman, oh, there he is, okay. Oh, one of the council members gave me one. Thank you, appreciate it.
Go
And
ahead,
give it
Adam,
to-
we'll get
Okay.
it taken care of.
So thanks for presenting this, or giving us the opportunity to appeal this. I have a few key points that I hope everybody's listening, maybe not. I have a few key points, people, hopefully you guys are listening. I have a question, or,
So Adam,
Yeah.
you're not nearly as loud as Holly.
Oh, really?
Could you maybe use the, that's a compliment, sort of, I guess. I just want to make sure we can hear
Compliment for you anyway.
without, having you strain your neck there.
how's that?
I think
There,
that's
that's
Can you
better.
hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay. I'm hoping that each council member has received a copy of our appeals and read through, thought about them, and then seen the, I guess, the rebuttal from the other two the city and the applicant. So my main concerns are that the fourth story does not meet the criteria that the city has laid out clearly. And if we could pull up, can we put up, you're getting it? Okay. So the conditional use permit, it says that, or one of the stipulations is that if the topography lends itself to 4 stories, it may be acceptable. The important thing to keep in mind is how do the 4 stories appear, you know, from the vantage point. The studies done by the applicant, all of the sightline visual, you know, the studies to see how the buildings will appear were done from a vantage point off-site of the parcel and higher elevation. That's key. Reason that that's key is because if we pull up that section which talks about it, it says that the surveyor, the surveyor or the person that is checking the vantage point, they have to actually look from on-site of the parcel at the highest point within the parcel.
It's buried about a third away in your packet. This is what you're looking for, Mr. Pepin? While they're pulling it
Yeah,
up.
yeah. And I'd like to point out that the drawing or the graph there was me taking about 30 seconds with my Excel just trying to do a depiction.
Yeah, he's looking
And
for the language and this graphic, if you can find that in your
Yep, it's
packet
here.
about a
Yeah.
third of the way in.
So what I'd like to point out is that the surveys were done from a high elevation when they should have been done from a lower elevation. And here's a simple graphic. If I'm standing here looking at the podium, it looks like a pretty short podium, right? If I'm standing here close to the floor, that's a pretty tall podium from this vantage point. The requirement that the code states is that the study is taken from here, which is the highest point within the parcel, not the neighborhoods out here to make it appear smaller. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, the vantage point. So that's one of my main points. So I feel that the hearing examiner made a clearly erroneous decision in approving the 4th story because the vantage point, here we go. Okay, right there. Sorry, let me come over. I think everybody understands, but go up if you would, please. Oh, right. Okay, right here. So this is the verbiage. This is what we're here to talk about solely, right? Yes. Oh, okay. I'm not used to fancy. Okay. Okay, right here. So this is section 4.61 says that in essence, it's maybe okay to build 4 stories. 4 or 5 stories in height, but only if the specific proposal is located on a site where the topography lends itself to a taller development such that the apparent height from the higher elevation on the site, again, this vantage point looking at the buildings, but the study was done from this vantage point outside the parcel looking down, so we don't know how those buildings are gonna appear because they didn't do the study correctly. And I remind you that that right there is why we're here tonight. It's one of the main, that's basically all that we're supposed to be talking about is this 4th story. So I hope you guys take that into account. Some of the other things I pointed out in my appeal was, well, let me back up, I'm sorry. So I want to say again, I think the hearing examiner clearly made an error in interpreting that requirement, and therefore his decision should be overturned or appealed or whatever the right legal term is. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the environmental impact of this. Obviously, the SEPA, which is the environmental study, I'm glad that Mr. Hoffman mentioned it was done in 2004. Obviously, long time ago, things have really changed. But there's no expiration date on SEPAs. But what's not correct about this 4th story is that the taller a building is, the more sound reflection or reverberation you have, right? Think of being in downtown Seattle, skyscraper, or, tall buildings. The sound bounces around because they're tall, right? If those buildings were 1 story, it's not bad. If they're 2 stories, it's a little worse. 20 stories, it's worse. More sound, right? Bouncing around. The taller a building does affect the way that sound reflects. My point here is that a 3-story building is going to be less of a noise impact than a 4-story building. Part of the SEPA regulation or rules are that noise generated from the site is a consideration within their decision. So therefore, this 4th story is completely relevant for a new SEPA examination or study because there's another story, 4th story. It's going to be louder because there's extra, another floor. And it was comical because in the rebuttal, the written rebuttal here, it says something like, another story doesn't make it louder or something like that. So I'm kind of anxious to see, but keep in mind downtown Seattle, tall buildings, it's louder than being in a place surrounded by short buildings. So it does make a difference. The other thing about the 4th story is that not only does the sound bounce around, but it could project the sound right toward the adjoining neighborhood. We don't know if that's the case because there hasn't been a sound or a noise study done for this.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Can you explain? I'm sorry. It is. It's in my appeal.
But there has to actually be evidence in the record, not just you saying that.
So,
Evidence of sound studies, scientific review that's been done, the documents.
so you
that it is
disagree?
actually.
Okay.
It's
I
not whether
understand.
I disagree
Right.
or you have a personal opinion, it's whether
Yeah.
there's evidence in the record. So if there's not evidence,
Okay.
then you should not
I
be
see.
referring to.
Okay. My personal opinion is that a city with tall buildings generates, the sound behaves differently than a city with shorter buildings. I don't have scientific information in front of me, but I would hope that just as we expect the sun to come up every day, the same holds true for it is louder if you're in buildings or around buildings that are taller. The other thing I wanted to mention is the SEPA study. It estimated that the ridge should be completed by 2010, 6 years after it was printed. It's 2018, it's still not finished, right? That's just one of the many examples of how this SEPA study is so incorrect that we need a new one. It forecasted 2010 as the completion date for Snoqualmie Ridge. Here we are, 2018, not complete. We don't know the noise impacts. Last point I wanted to make is in the application from the applicant on May 25th, 2017, there are, in all of the written references as to how many buildings there are, or how many stories are in each building, all of the written, as in words, not necessarily maps, but all of the written references are that it'll have 4 of the 5 buildings with 4 stories. What we're talking about tonight is 5 of the buildings having 4 stories. So my point being, the application is, it's incorrect by their own admission. Okay, here, I'll show you. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot about I'm used to my cats chasing a laser pointer, not using it for business. Okay, please go to page 1.
Jason, can you just find it real quick, or we're?
You're there, you just need to scroll down.
Oh, down,
Scroll
down. Go down more. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay, keep going. Keep going. Well, on here I think it says page 1, but it's not. Yeah, I think it's, okay, here we go, the bottom of this page. Okay. Request for permit for 4 of the 11 buildings. 4, not 5. We're talking about 5 buildings tonight. This is the application that's referenced for the project. If you'll go forward to page 10, please. Okay, okay, keep going. A little more.
All right. If there's no objection from the parties, I feel the city caused Mr. Babcock some delays in not having the earlier graphics or material up there, so I'm going to afford him an extra minute. That won't be charged against his rebuttal. Any objections to that? All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Page 10, right here. 1, so 4 stories, 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings. Not 5 buildings, but 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then next page, please. And this is a nice one. I hope you guys remember. Scroll down, please. Okay, all right, right here. Because the multifamily use itself is permitted by blah, 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 the only conditional aspect of the application is for the 4th story proposed for 4 buildings in parcel S20. Not 5, but 4 right here, okay? 4 buildings, the only conditional aspect. So the whole basis of this is, in my opinion, invalid because the application doesn't even state the right amount of floors or the buildings that are going to be. Now, some would say that that's a typo. Some would say it's misleading. You can form your own opinions. Okay, is that time?
If you could conclude your comments, Mr. Babcock, yeah.
The only other thing I was going to say is that there were a couple of other sections in the same document where it references clearly 4 out of 5, or 4 buildings, not 5. That's about it.
All right,
So, thanks, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. All right, with that, I'll ask, are you or Mr. Murphy Mr. Murphy? All right, thank you. If you could come forward. And you're speaking on behalf of the applicant for Panorama Apartments. How much time? Is this the same kind of split?
20 also? No.
Okay. All right, 20 minutes, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you.
Hang on just a second.
Surprised our timer goes above 3.
Okay.
So, good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. As mentioned before, my name is Andy Murphy, and I am here on behalf of the applicant, Panorama Apartments, LLC. We ask you to affirm the hearing examiner's decision because the appellants have not met their high burden of showing that it was clearly erroneous. And I'd like to begin by supplementing Director Hoffman's description of the project. And so if we can pull up Exhibit 2 from the hearing, from the CUP hearing, and we also have hard copies, so you can actually see the data a little bit easier. And Jason was kind enough to print these out for us earlier.
I have a question, just out of fairness. Did the appellants ask the city to print out anything, and if so, was that granted?
If I certainly would have.
No, but we have extra copies of everything.
Okay, I just want to make sure that
Yep.
no one got special treatment on printing. It sounds crazy, but I just want to make sure that that didn't happen.
So, unless there are any other questions. Eagle Point is up here, and as mentioned before, the carriage houses are here. These carriage houses are 3 stories and are not subject to the CUP. They are allowed outright. They were placed there intentionally to be a transition from the single-family homes in Eagle Point to the apartment development. That transition continues with these 3-story buildings, 2 3-story buildings, which are also outside the scope of the CUP hearing. Those are also allowed outright. The 5 buildings that are at issue are F, G, H, J, and K down here. And the only matter that's before the council today then that was submitted to the hearing examiner is the difference between adding a 4th story to 5 buildings. That's the only issue. It's quite a narrow review that we're here for. And the hearing examiner's decision is incredibly thorough. He took public comment, he heard testimony, he spent 2 months reviewing the materials and the evidence that was coupled with several site visits to the parcel S20, and he correctly concluded that the application met every criteria that applies to approve the CUP. And that's what the council is here to review. Whether those laws that Mr. Sturbank mentioned at the beginning applied to those facts as developed in the record was clearly erroneous, and it was not. We can see what those factors are on page 3 of the hearing examiner's decision. That's a nice summary of where the final plan criteria in section 4.6.1 and the city code criteria are listed. And can we also pull that up? Page 3 of the hearing examiner's decision. The final plan for SR2 specifically contemplated that certain parcels would lend themselves to higher development. It recognized that certain buildings could or should be taller than just 3 stories if certain criteria were met. And they are laid out on the bottom half of that page. There we are. So there's about 4 criteria that are listed in here, and only 1 is challenged. There is no dispute that, for this first one, that the proposal is located on a site where the existing topography lends itself to a taller development. That's outside the scope, but S20 does lend itself to taller development because of the 14-grade slope on it and that drop in elevation that Director Hoffman had mentioned before. I'll skip this next one and come back to it. This is the one that Mr. Babcock challenges, whether the height would be look to be no more than 2 or 3 stories. But I'll also highlight that there are 2 design components for the structures, and those are also have not been challenged. There's no dispute that the proposal meets those particular requirements. So the only criteria that's challenged here in 4.6.1 is the height issue that Mr. Babcock has raised. And he has challenged that issue by pointing to Exhibit 1 in the CUP hearing record. But there is other evidence that was developed in the record that shows that criteria is met, and it is before you. It is the elevation plan. And what the hearing examiner pointed out, that he was particularly persuaded by this data. And you can see in the red for each of these buildings, it lists the elevation height for each building. It shows that from the pitch of the roof, what that height is. And the first three, the carriage houses, those are the tallest buildings on parcel S20. The tallest one has an elevation of 1,098.8 feet. That's building C. It's the tallest building. That's a 3-story building that's allowed outright. The 2-story buildings, so this is Exhibit 1. The elevation study is the one that I'm referencing, which is also the hard copy that the council members have. The next stories are the 3-story apartment buildings, and those are all taller than the 4-story buildings that the CUP permit applies to. So the 3-story buildings that are allowed outright are taller. They have a higher, not taller, they have a higher elevation than the other buildings do that are subject to the CUP. And because the application has positioned the 4th-story buildings lower down on the site, their elevation is lower than the buildings that are 2 or 3 stories. And that meets the criteria. There is the graphic that Mr. Babcock has presented is contradicted by this study, which the hearing, not this study, this elevation analysis, which the hearing examiner found to be done consistent with the way civil engineers do their work. It is scientific, and the accuracy of this exhibit has not been challenged. This is a verity on appeal, and it conclusively shows that the 4th-story buildings all have a lower height from the 2- and 3-story buildings that are allowed outright when looking down on them. This is evidence alone to find that the criteria that has been challenged is satisfied, and that the hearing examiner's decision was not clearly erroneous. But let's also talk about the exhibits that Mr. Babcock has taken issue with. So that's the ones before. Let's start with 1A. And what these viewshed or sightline analyses are, they show just a few feet over from neighboring parcels, so folks in Eagle Point, when they look down at the panorama apartments, this is what their vantage point would be. And that was done as a conservative analysis. When you are standing higher, you see more, you see better. But what happens here is that, as the hearing examiner found, the building design, the topography, and the landscaping blocks the views of the 4th-story buildings, so you would never see them when you're up there. And we can see this here. When you're looking up, you don't even see the 4-story buildings below. When you're looking down, it's blocked by the buildings that are allowed outright. Moreover, because the topography is sloped, and in order to comply with ADA requirements, there had to be some terracing. This is part of the issue why the retaining walls were necessary. And these retaining walls create wells where the buildings are tucked in. So you can't see that bottom floor when you're looking down at it, even if you could look through the buildings that are allowed outright. So when someone is standing on the parcel, which is what the parcel, the highest elevation of that site, they're not going to be able to look down and see buildings that are 4th stories. Even if you could look through these buildings, it would appear to be only 1, 2, 3 stories, which meets the criteria in 4.6.1. So let's move on to the...
Can we ask questions or not?
I'm happy
Not
at this time, not at this time. Just keep notes, please.
Sure.
Continue.
Let's move on to the criteria imposed by the city code, which is back on page 3 of the hearing examiner's decision. And again,
Mr. Murphy, unless you want to allow for just a clarifying question if someone's confused and just wants to clarify what you said.
I'm happy to answer questions.
All right.
Councilmember Ross?
Okay, it gets back to my height question. So the topography, can you tell me at the 3-story, what's the height? Is it like 1,047 or 1,000 compared to the 4-story? Is it all the same height?
So that's shown on the elevation study, and that's
Right.
the red numbers in each of them. And so they are not all the same, but what's important for the review of the CUP is that the fourth-story buildings all have a lower elevation relative to sea level than the three-story buildings.
Okay, so 1,095 is a three-story building, and a four-story building is 1,085.
And that's based off elevation because of
Right.
the slope of the site.
Right, yeah,
It's not
that's
the,
right.
the height of the building, it's the pitch of the roof relative to sea level.
Right, I agree. It's not
And the
super-
section drawings that we're seeing are to scale, so that's exactly what you'd see if they were built and a cut line was done through them, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
You said pitch of, did you mean peak of roof?
The peak of the roof, they're pitched roofs, and it's the very, very tallest point of the buildings.
Mr. Murphy, you're halfway just as a point, you're 10 minutes, so.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
And so the only criteria that's the ones above here, the only criteria that have been challenged are the third and the fifth issue. The third was that, and the Ms. Fletcher raised these, that it's not compatible with surrounding land uses. And she pointed to different communities, but what the criteria directs for analysis is the actual site. And it is important to focus on that it's not the entire Panorama Apartments development. It's the difference between a third-story building and a fourth-story building. So that's the impact that's at issue here. How does a fourth story fit in with the surrounding land uses? And both of the traffic experts that testified below, the applicants and the city's third party, said that adding a fourth story has no impact whatsoever on traffic at all. Traffic analysis is based on unit numbers inside a building, not how tall they are, not the number of bedrooms in a unit, it's unit number. And that's the scientifically accepted way to do it, and the hearing examiner found that these studies were done in a scientifically credible way. There's no contrary evidence in the record. Ms. Fletcher mentioned that there was some testimony that said that units that have more bedrooms will produce more traffic trips. And there's some nuance there. That applies to neighborhood studies, but that's not what's necessary for traffic analysis. When you do a traffic analysis, you look to the ITE manual. Most traffic engineers will do this. That was established in the record below. And in the ITE manual, it takes, it's an aggregate of all different types of certain buildings. They provide a certain rate, and that rate was accurately used below. So when using the ITE rate, which does not account for bedrooms, the traffic engineers concluded that the four-story would have no impact whatsoever on traffic. For the building and site design compatibility, the four-story, the hearing examiner found, was addressed because the buildings with the four stories would be placed lower on the parcel, and the carriage houses would serve as a transition for the single-family home neighborhoods above it, and the three-story buildings would also serve as a buffer. So the placement of the four-story buildings is appropriate and addresses that. Ms. Fletcher's focused on bedroom size of these units, but that's not an issue for the CUP criteria. City code does not restrict bedroom size, and the impacts are actually evaluated by unit number, not bedroom number. The fifth criteria has also come at issue, and those are the impacts. Again, the impacts to schools and to traffic are measured by the number of residential units, not by the individual number of bedrooms. That's how it was done in the EIS. That's scientifically accepted. The City Council approved that back in 2004, and the FEIS has never been challenged. Moreover, the FEIS approved the impacts for construction of up to 2,150 residential units. It's been built out under the option that allows for 1,850, and we are well below that, even with full build-out of this proposal. But it's also important to note that this is the CUP about 4 stories, not the number of units. So the impacts that have been identified are not going to be influenced by the CUP. That was something to deal with before, when the council approved that this parcel could be used for densities up to 16 units per for the density range for these units. And those are the only challenges that have come up. And the hearing examiner heard these at the hearing, was not persuaded by them, and the appellants haven't come forth with evidence to contradict the scientifically accepted analysis that was provided below. Mr. Babcock has raised the issue about the reliability of the EIS. And the point here is that the EIS was drafted and approved when SR2 was still being a concept, and there was plan for flexibility to build out as necessary. And certain parcels could be changed to meet needs as appropriate. Parcel S20 isn't one of them. Parcel S20 was always designated for multifamily housing and to have the density that's being used. So the changes that might justify a new EIS don't apply to this particular project. And it certainly doesn't apply to adding a 4-story, which the final plan allowed and which was studied in the EIS and approved by the City Council. Moreover,
5 minutes, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The EIS has been shown to be accurate with what the impacts were projected. In 2004, it projected that the intersection of Snoqualmie Parkway and Jacobia, the main intersection to get into S20, would operate at a level of service B. A consistency analysis was done in 2016 that measured the state of traffic, and it concluded that it operated at a level of service B. That is exactly what was predicted and is exactly as measured. And those same studies concluded that if the CUP was approved, that there would be no impact to traffic whatsoever. So we're within the impacts that have already been studied in the EIS, and there's no basis to require a new one. Mr. Babcock also pointed out an error in the application regarding the number of buildings, and that was a harmless error. To begin, it was corrected on the record at the hearing. There's no dispute about that. And the error was caught by the city. It's true that in the aspects that Mr. Babcock pointed out, it did say four buildings were subject to the permit, but the substantive materials, including the elevation plan and the grading plans, identified the 5 buildings that were at issue. The city caught that error. It approved it for 5, or recommended approval for 5 buildings, and the hearing examiner caught it, and he recommended it for 5 buildings. And it's the hearing examiner's decision that's on appeal, and he has approved 5 buildings subject to this, consistent with what the applicant has requested. To the extent there was an error, the decision makers caught it, and it was corrected on the record. There's no basis to reverse the hearing examiner's decision because of it.
So, Mr. Murphy, if I could clarify from my understanding, your assertion is that the hearing examiner did not make his decision with the assumption that it was only 4 buildings. He clearly knew it was 5 buildings, therefore his decision was not erroneous because he was aware of the facts.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And that's consistent with what the city's advisory report did. That's where they first, they correctly noted that the application was for 5 buildings, and that's what the hearing examiner reviewed. And at the very beginning of the hearing, Ms. Gigi put on the record, I think at around 11 minutes, and corrected the error about the number of buildings that the application was subject to. Ms. Fletcher also said that there is an issue about the project exceeding the minimum number of affordable housing that's required. And that is a collateral issue. A number of affordable housing units that are provided are governed by the minor modification that has been finalized, and it can't be collaterally attacked through this conditional use permit. But it's also important to note that when approving SR2, providing affordable housing was an objective of the city. And there is, I think, no doubt that affordable housing is needed and it would be valued. It is in the public's interest to provide more than the bare minimum amount of affordable housing. Moreover, because of the way the credit system is developed, if the applicant is planning to rent out its units to folks who make less than or up to 60% of the median income in King County, but if they eventually only rent units to folks who earn up to 80%, then the credits will only be 1 per unit. So all 189 units would be needed to satisfy the housing credits. In closing, I will again emphasize that the law that applies to this conditional use permit are the conditions in the mixed use final plan 4.6.1. The hearing examiner's decision properly relied on scientific authority that is unchallenged, that's the elevation study, and that the impacts that have been identified by the appellants are not supported by the evidence. Adding a 4-story will not cause will have no impact on the concerns that they have. The hearing examiner's decision was well supported by evidence. It was not clearly erroneous, and we ask you to affirm it. And if there are any questions, I'll take them if I
Well,
can.
just quickly, you have about 40 seconds left, and I'm not sure if unless I wasn't paying attention, that you spoke to the school district impact issue that Ms. Fletcher raised.
Well, the school district issue is also raised, that's also counted by unit number. It's not counted by number of bedroom size. And in the EIS, it was approved by City Council up to 2,150. At full build out, we're only at with full build out of the Panorama Apartments, it will be 1,747 units. That's 100 units less than what is allowed and what has already been approved. Moreover, and the fourth story is not going to impact that. That's governed by the minor modification.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a point of order? I'm
Yes.
just curious as to your role in the ex parte, quasi-judicial. Are you a sitting member of the board here, or of our review, or are you allowed to ask questions and those sorts of things? I'm just want clarification so we have
I guess I'll
clear.
leave that for the city attorney to.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we have clarification.
He's
so we
the,
have clear
he's the
understanding.
presiding officer, which, so he has
But
the
he-
ability to ask
is-
ask
and
questions.
no disrespect, I just want to make sure we're
understand.
following the proper procedures. Does the mayor have the ability then to ask questions pertaining to the subject at hand? Or is he, as presiding officer, only has a role as a presiding officer?
Typically, the presiding officer has the ability to ask questions. I mean, you've seen that from week to week. The mayor also may, given that there are 6 council members, be called upon to break a tie.
Okay, that was my second question,
right,
is to
yeah.
understand how
So if
that
the mayor
works.
is going to vote, I would anticipate I would ask him the ex parte.
Okay. I want to just make
For
sure
the
we're all,
appearance, fairness
everything's
doctrine
clear.
questions before we do
From a
that.
fairness standpoint, exactly. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Lasay. Okay, so now we'll ask for a response from Kim Pratt for the city of Snoqualmie.
Thank you.
20 minutes, right?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Sorry.
Just, could we have a just brief recess so I could refill my water?
Sure, so if there's no objections from anybody, we'll go ahead and have about a
45
4-minute
seconds.
recess. Let's come up to 8.
If you'd bring me
That'll
one,
do.
I
I'll
don't
get
have to
you
do
water.
anything.
Okay.
We'll,
Because I've
we'll
given mine
re-adjourn it.
away.
We'll re-adjourn. All right. We are now reconvened.
I'm going to go ahead and wait. I think I've got one
Okay. that's
council
fine.
member.
You want me to go bang on the door?
We're down to 5.
Jim's getting his coffee again.
About to my plus.
Keep filling his water, don't you?
No, I do not. I try to avoid this. I keep taking your water.
Sorry about that, Ms. Powell.
No problem.
Oh, it was you were waiting for.
All right, let us know when you wish to proceed.
We could have told you that.
All right, I'm ready to go if everybody else is. Please stop me at any time and ask questions. And actually, I can ask right now, having read our written brief, the response, does anyone have any questions I can answer right now and just sort of get that off the table? If not, I can answer them as we go, which I'll go ahead and do. Okay. No, it doesn't. So as legislators, the Snoqualmie City Council has been planning for affordable housing in SR2 since at least 2004, when those final documents, the development agreement and the mixed-use final plan, were adopted. So this has been going on for quite a while. As legislatures, this body has been working on that. Maybe not you as individuals, but the City Council has. And as you know, affordable housing is mandated on the city by the Growth Management Act from the state, and the King County countywide planning policies. So you've got to deal with affordable housing, and you have been. So what those legislative documents did is they set the framework for you tonight to now sit as a quasi-judicial body. But you can't, as you've already heard multiple times tonight from the city attorney, you can't rehash or redecide what what you made, those decisions you made as legislatures in those final documents. And they gave you criteria to decide this conditional use permit tonight. And that's all you are able to base this decision on, is whether or not the hearing examiner made a clearly erroneous decision based on those criteria. All right? So in the substantive arguments that appellant has made, first dealing with the traffic, you heard we need an unbiased opinion on traffic. And specifically, the city did have an unbiased review done of the applicant's traffic analysis. And that analysis, in part, was does this project actually the traffic analysis was for 200 units, not merely adding 4 out of 5 stories. And we had an independent analysis done by Chris Breland at Fair and Pierce to see if that information was accurate. And he testified to the hearing examiner that it was. He found that this affordable housing project is consistent with the analysis that was already done in the EIS. So it was consistent. It might have been done in 2004, but it was reviewed in 2016, and I believe Chris's report is in 2017, and it was found to still be accurate. And that is the information that the SEPA official, Mr. Hoffman, reviewed to decide if a supplement needed to be done for the environmental impact statement. So he is using updated information from unbiased third parties and deciding that that EIS did not need to be redone, did not need to be supplemented. He was also looking at specific criteria in the Washington Administrative Code that guides us through the State Environmental Policy Act. So it tells him to look for, is there any new information, or is there a significant change? And so he looked at those criteria, and in the staff report did that analysis and saw he did not see anything in adding this additional story that would trigger more a supplemental environmental impact statement. So that analysis was done, and it has been updated to see if it is still accurate. During the public hearing, Mr. Breland he directly addressed citizens' concerns and very frank comments about traffic congestion. And he acknowledged there is traffic congestion. He understands that is a real concern of those residents. But he tried to explain to us non-traffic engineers how the calculations are done, and he called it complex, but he explained it, I thought, quite well, that it uses a weighted average. So if you have one very congested lane, the way I understand it is that the other three that aren't congested make up for it when you're using a weighted average. So that's how the system works. That's how LOS works. And the applicant, when this project adding a fourth story is weighed against that, it doesn't trip anything. We still have, you're still within the LOS standard that the city has set. And you can't require the applicant to meet a higher standard than what you have set right now. That would be something you could look at later, but it wouldn't change this project. Mr. Breland also addressed Ms. Fletcher's concern about the number of bedrooms and the impact that traffic would have on that. He talked about the number of bedrooms in general, and he did say the ITE, it uses a mixed number of bedrooms in its apartments when it looks at, you know, what an apartment unit generates in traffic. So what I heard him saying, and I reviewed the testimony again twice today, was that the ITE, it is mixed in there. It's melded in that number, but it doesn't specifically say if you have 5-bedroom units, then you generate this much traffic. If you have 3-bedroom units, you generate this much traffic. But it is melded into the analysis. But then what I thought was really good about his testimony before the hearing examiner was he said, but I also take a rational approach. He's listening to these common sense understanding of people who are sitting in traffic. And he said, but I also take this rational approach. How close is this project to tripping us into failure on the streets? Are we close? Should I take another look at number of units? And he said, it's not even close. A fourth story by no means trips anything in traffic. And so he did try and see, you know, is there really something I should be looking at with this number of bedrooms? And there wasn't. It's just not even close as far as the traffic engineer who's looking at it in the standardized methods. In regard to the apparent height, I would get down like Mr. Babcock did, but I am wearing a dress, so I'm not going to do that. But I think you can picture and you look at the roof peak elevations, and I don't think he's quite understanding what those roof peak elevations show. If you're standing on the property, you aren't going to see those taller buildings. They are not going to look any higher than 2 or 3 stories, and that's what those roof elevations show. And I listened to that engineer again today. He specifically said they're measured from the roof peak, so they're not trying to cheat and get on the lower part. He said roof peak, and he specifically said from on site they will look no higher than 3 stories. So he did directly address that criteria. And I'd say that I think they were being overly conservative when they were also talking about what is it going to look like from the neighbor's property, because that's what most of the people in the room were concerned about. And that's what most of the people in the room were testifying about is, what am I going to see from my deck? What am I going to see from my front yard? So they were trying to address that. The hearing examiner was listening to everybody, and he says in his decision that it's going to appear no more than 2 or 3 stories from on-site and neighboring properties. I believe he's putting neighboring properties in there as a saying to the people who are testifying, I was listening to you, you know, tell me your complaints. He listened to everything everyone said. In terms of compatibility of scale, one of Ms. Fletcher's arguments, the question isn't whether affordable housing is compatible on parcel S20 with the surrounding neighborhood, because that's already allowed. The question isn't, is affordable housing or multifamily or anything like that already allowed? It specifically is a fourth story compatible with the surrounding neighborhoods. And then Ms. Fletcher goes into number of bedrooms. But first, dealing with the story, that really is, to me, in a simplified manner, it's what does it look like? You know, I've got single family homes, and then I've got apartment buildings that are larger. If I stand, you know, right next to it, they are taller than maybe a single family home. But what the criteria did, what the council did with that criteria that they put in to the development agreement was it has to look smaller. It has to only look 2 or 3 stories. And the applicant, I think you see, has worked very hard to meet that criteria. They're setting these larger buildings down into, I heard the engineer use the term wells. They're sinking them down into these wells, and then they used the topography of the site, and they placed the larger buildings at the bottom of the site, so you're not seeing them. I think that was obviously very strategic, so they could meet this criteria and get that extra, extra level. Ms. Fletcher also says that these fourth story isn't compatible because it will allow more bedrooms in a unit. And in our brief, we talked about that a couple ways. One is that when I'm looking at the outside of an apartment building, I don't know how many bedrooms are in it. I also, when I'm looking at the outside of a house, I don't know how many bedrooms are in it. So I don't believe that you know, externally, that's not incompatible. I can have 5 bedrooms in a house, and I can have 5 bedrooms in an affordable apartment unit. What I understand her to be saying maybe more clearly is that it just adds people. This adds people to the site, and that is not compatible. It's just too big. That's what I understand her to be saying. And I think the council in the final documents for SR2 dealt with a number of units, and it did limit the number of units per acre on parcel S20. And this project does not exceed that. So there is a limit, and it's not exceeded. And the council in those documents did not limit the number of bedrooms. A number of bedrooms isn't a criteria. In our brief at the very end, we did go into that, trying to show and explain that the number of bedrooms isn't a limit in those governing documents. The portion that Ms. Fletcher, that she's addressing, where it does talk about number of bedrooms, it's a formula for price for the units, and I find it a little complicated because the median income for affordable housing is based on how many people is in your household. So you have to know how many people in the household and then how many bedrooms. And that's why that's in that document, not to limit the number of bedrooms. It does not say that it's going to limit the number of bedrooms in an apartment building.
Sorry, I have a question.
Councilmember Mayhew.
Is that fact somewhere in the record, that the reason for that requirement was just stated as there was a reason given, that was there for a reason? Is that reason in the record? Is it established that that is the reason?
I believe what you're hearing is argument about the wording of the language in attachment G to the mixed-use final plan, which contains this language that all the parties have pointed to about the number of bedrooms. So,
right,
and their interpretation based on what that language says is it's to address pricing, because there's reference in that language to pricing.
Right, but do we have, is it in the record that the city council's reason for adopting that language is solely for pricing? Is that, because I don't see that when I read it.
I don't believe it's stated that way. I believe, as I said, I believe what you're hearing is an argument from all of the parties about what the meaning of the language in attachment G is taken together.
Right, I'm just getting to the point is if something's not on the record, it shouldn't be
But the,
argued, right?
Yeah, I know
Attachment
what you're
G
getting
is
to,
in the
Councilor Mayo. I wanted to hear if Mark could add something to that.
Yeah, I would add to Bob, what you're hearing is plain English interpretation of what we're reading, not being in the room at that moment and not seeing that explicitly written in that the city council intended it, nor using the words maximum. It's an assumption.
but
That's an
attachment
assumption
G
that's not
is,
in the record?
attachment G to the mixed-use final plan is in the record.
I understand, but this,
Okay.
this statement about what attachment G's intent was, is that in the record?
That's argument, is what you're hearing, from all parties.
And that's appropriate?
And that's appropriate
not-
legal
okay, thank
argument
you.
about the meaning of a document in the record.
So I would invite you to, and I believe you already have, looked at attachment G. And the other thing that we addressed in our brief was, you'll see it says may. It does not restrict it with a shall. It does not give a maximum. And it does that in other places, even in attachment G. And so I am assuming, I am arguing the intent of the council based on the language in attachment G. I assume that the council, when they adopted that, meant what they said, and it says may, and it says it is a price calculation for section 7. So that is specifically in the document. It says it's a price calculation, and the word may is specifically in attachment G.
Ms. Pratt, just check your time. You're about 4 minutes, 16 seconds, so unless you want to just keep doing questions.
Yeah, is there any questions I can answer? I'm happy to do that.
All right, please continue.
Okay. I will address the school impacts. Ms. Fletcher says those haven't been minimized. There is a good section in the hearing examiner's decision. He does specifically address that. Notice was given to the school district as is required by the code. And the school district their needs are specifically addressed also in those final documents adopted by the council, and he points those out in his decision. He was aware of those. He also takes recognition of the impact fees that the school district gets for these developments, and he recognizes that in the EIS, where school impacts have to be considered, there was a maximum number of units of 1850 chosen, and that is not being exceeded. So he did go through the analysis of were the school impacts addressed. He looked at the evidence, and we would argue he did not make a clearly erroneous decision on the school districts. Any other questions about the school districts? No? Okay. And I believe I've already addressed the traffic impacts that Ms. Fletcher is talking about. Again, you have to make the narrow, take the narrow view of does a fourth story traffic impacts that have not been addressed already in the EIS. There's also testimony from Mr. Breland that these roads were built out as they should be and have the capacity to serve this project, especially an additional story on 5 of the buildings. And the hearing examiner made what I think is a common sense note in his decision that, the residents have been using these roads with it being under capacity. And yes, now it is going to add people, it is going to add cars, but those were planned for by those final documents. In regard to the application saying 4 buildings, not 5, wanting the extra story, I think the hearing examiner did look at that, or he did consider that. He listened to Mr. Babcock, and he found that to be a harmless error because the city analyzed 5 buildings going up a story. They caught the error and they dealt with it, and that was what was thoroughly analyzed, and that is what the hearing examiner analyzed. So while it is a misstatement, he considered it a harmless error. That's all I have. I would be happy to answer questions. I have 1 minute and 4 seconds left. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Pratt.
Yes, there is.
All right. So, Ms. Fletcher, you have an opportunity for a rebuttal for the balance of your time. You still have 9 minutes for a rebuttal. You don't have to use 9 minutes, but
Well, okay, we'll see how it goes. I'm going to be all over the place here trying to catch on these points that we've discussed. So how my concerns over bedroom size relates to the fourth story. Mr. Ratliff testified that if the CUP is denied, the result will be units of smaller size. That is the direction we need to take for the benefit of the city and its residents. The fourth story directly impacts the inclusion of these, the hearing examiner termed these apartments giant apartments. That's the term that the hearing examiner used for these 4 and 5 bedroom size units. Okay, in regards to, so Mr. Murray said that, you know, it's not a CUP criteria. What we're discussing and some of the points that I brought about. We don't need to bring up that page 3 again, but basically, you know, the criteria is that it's not going to be detrimental to public welfare. It will be compatible with surrounding land uses. It will keep with the goals of the comprehensive plan. I mean, never was the plan to have massive units, 4 stories, development agreement. We'll touch on that 3-bedroom maximum later, but the plan was never this high of a concentration. Another point, another criteria, all measures should be taken to minimize possible adverse impacts which the proposed use may have on the area to which it's located. Going to the 4 stories gives them the capacity to have 4 and 5 bedroom units. So yeah, it's definitely a criteria that we need to consider because we're talking about the adverse impacts of the development. I would like to just touch briefly on Mr. Ratliff testified that there's this demand for these large units. And I would like to just kind of just point out the difference between demand and need and ask the City Council if our goals in providing affordable housing are to meet the desires and wishes of the occupants or to meet their needs. I think if we keep our vision in line with meeting needs, we'll avoid unnecessary burdens. The standard is indeed limited to a maximum of 3 bedrooms. Again, we'll refer to those apartment complexes in the city, Woodlands and Echo Ridge, 3 bedrooms maximum, 3 stories maximum. I'm a part of some online community groups. Probably some of you on the council are as well. Facebook groups, and you'll often see requests for housing. Never have I seen a request go out for a five. Hey, I'm looking for a 5-bedroom unit, you know, for my my family or myself, whatever. I think the developer has failed to prove that units of this size are necessary. Let's touch on the point Ms. Pratt made about that being used as a formula only. She did clarify that that's her assumption, that the verbiage there was providing a formula, that it may include 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom units. But going along with that, she says that that's a non-restrictive term. I would argue that even if that's the case, just because something is possible or something may be allowed does not mean that it's a reasonable solution or that restrictions should not be implemented. Careful consideration needs to be taken for site-specific limitations. Specifically, this area only has 1 access road. There is lack of public transportation, which is ideal for affordable housing sites. Current traffic issues, overcrowding of schools may not be reasonable. So even if that's the argument, I still stand that just based on, you know, if this is a fuzzy area throughout this process when something has been questionable, we look at the city's existing actions, what they've done in the past. So again, let's look at what we have. The apartment complexes that we have are limited to 3 bedrooms and 3 stories high. So in my opinion, that's a restriction that has been implemented and is still standing today. Let's go to, sorry here, back to Ms. Pratt said something about, she touched on the traffic analysis, and Mr. Brayland, I had stated this before in my opening, stated multiple times that a larger unit will generate additional trips. He did justify this by stating that the IT, and I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what the ITC stands for, but basically, I know that it's the data that they use to look at, traffic studies, right? And this data, he said, is based on a mix of bedrooms across the United States. So, but it's an important point to make that only 3% of affordable housing projects across the United States include units that are over 3 bedrooms. So it's not even applicable to this particular project. It's not a fair comparison because the data that they're using is from, a collection of units across the United States. It just doesn't pertain. Let's go to, okay, so yeah, the CUP directly impacts traffic implications. Mr. Braylon testified that, again, that the larger unit will generate additional trips, and then Mr. Ratliff from DevCo testified that the CUP was, if the CUP is denied, the result will be units in smaller size. So as a result, denial of the CUP results in smaller units. As a result, denial of the CUP will result in less traffic implications. I mean, it's just kind of basic math there. If such and such equals this, such and such, In Mark Hoffman's post-hearing response regarding not notifying the school district, he stated that the Snoqualmie Valley School District was not considered an agency with jurisdiction, known to the director at the time of application, and was not mailed a notice of application. And if we can bring up, Jason, that page. So that was point number 3 here. He said he, at the time, did not deem them I just lost at the time of application was not mailed. Okay, so I would argue that if we can go down to point 6 here, a copy of the notice of action may be mailed to public or private groups which the director knows to have an interest in the particular proposal or the type of proposal being considered. I don't understand how the school district could not be considered a party of interest. They will obviously have jurisdiction over the students residing in the development. It is the school district that will be required to absorb the potential for hundreds of students in schools that are already over capacity and struggling to comply with state requirements to limit the number of students in each classroom. The school district is a significant party of interest to the ramifications of the development and should have been notified. The district was only notified to the degree that the rest of the residents were notified, which is not. I mean, unless you lived within 500 feet, how many people are perusing the city website for regular updates? And how many people receive the newspaper? And of the few people that receive the newspaper, how many of those newspapers make it past the recycle bin? Unit size was not communicated openly in postings. Someone would have had to read the developer application to learn of its inclusion. I just find this completely unreasonable. Ms. Pratt did talk briefly about the school impact fees, saying that the school district, is compensated by school impact fees, and at full, SR2 build out. My question then would be: is the developer going to pay all school impact fees, or are they going to request reductions? And if the school district is not collecting all that they would have forecasted under this blanket total SR2, they were aware kind of thing, then that is concerning. 23 to 24 per 100, 23 to 24 students per 100 units is grossly understated when they want to put in 4 and 5 bedroom units. I think it's an important note to make that the fire department is not equipped with a truck capable of buildings with this height. Mr. Hoffman testified at 2 hours and 48 minutes into the recording that the truck that we would have the ability to use is in Issaquah. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Fletcher. Ms. Fletcher, I'll have to ask you to conclude your comments if you just want to wrap it up.
The CUP should be, can we not beep at me? Do we need to beep at me? 4 and 5 bedroom units is contrary to the development agreement. Mr. Murphy validated my point that size was ignored in traffic studies. Size was ignored in the school district being aware. Size was ignored.
Ms. Fletcher, by wrap up, I meant like one sentence.
Okay. Okay. I just we have the ability to shape development on S20 into something that meets the needs of our city, fulfills all credit obligations, and I hope that you as representatives of the city will evaluate all that has been presented to you this evening.
Thank you. Mr. Babcock, you have 7 minutes.
Can you put that large map on the screen, the one that you guys were each handed out? Okay, perfect. So I think we've all established and understand that when you look at the buildings, they cannot appear more than 3 stories, right? Not 4. My point being, okay, the vantage point. Your point is, the applicant's point is that even the taller buildings will appear shorter. But as we were working here, if we take a look at this map, the highest point of the parcel.
Use the laser pointer, Mr. Babcock. Laser pointer on the screen.
We won't see it on there.
Okay. So the requirement is that it's the study, that the vantage point is from the highest point on the parcel, right? If you look carefully at your map, it's over here, or abouts. I think it's, it says 1080, right? Right in there. So if this is where the study should have been done from, if you look straight down, these buildings do not block the view of these. They're not even in the same line of sight. They did the studies from over here, which means that they were looking through these buildings. That's the wrong, actually they did it here outside of the parcel. The requirement is that they should have done it right in this range, where they would look unobstructed, this building's not in the way. So my point being, we don't know if these buildings are going to appear taller than 3 stories because they viewed it from completely the wrong place. They viewed it from over here. And in the application, any questions on that, first of all?
I do.
Okay.
So you're using 1080. I look over at 1088 as the highest point.
Where's that?
To the right, 4 parcels. So if we're supposed to use the highest point, 1088 would be it, which matches what they had used as their line of sight. The other thing I would reference is my understanding is building F will sit at about a 10-foot retaining wall, so you wouldn't be able to see floor 1, and therefore you would only see 3 stories.
I'm not seeing 1088.
It's to the it's the farthest number to the right on parcel 785-339-0070.
I think it says 1080, right?
1088.
It's red. The number's in red, right below the topo.
Maybe I'll walk over and you can show me.
Right here.
Even that one of the intervening properties is 1084.
1088, so looking down. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's still. So my point is still valid, because if you take your line of sight from 1088, the corner of this building, you'd have to draw a straight line, right?
But since you asked for questions, I'm going to continue to comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
The retaining wall that separates D and F is, from memory, roughly 10 feet. You would cover up the first floor, so therefore you would never see the first floor from any of those parcels that are in question, the 1080, 1084, 1088. You'd only see stories 2 through 4. Therefore, it would appear to be a 3-story building.
We don't know for certain because the study was not done properly.
Mr. Babcock, just so you know, you can continue with your rebuttal.
Okay.
Or whatever. You don't have to take questions.
Okay. All right. And also the parcel, I'm not sure if 1088 refers to the elevation of the parcel next to it or the parcel, the subject parcel, right? We don't know. 1088 may be the elevation of the home, which is the incorrect vantage point, and our parcel has a higher elevation of maybe 1080. It's not clear because they didn't do the study correctly. Even if it is 1088, the straight line, we don't know if the retaining wall will block it because, again, the study wasn't proper. And the whole point of being here tonight is to talk about this CUP and whether the buildings will appear less than 3 feet or not. Or, I'm sorry, 3 stories. Okay, I gotta hurry up here because I'm almost out of time. The hearing examiner, in my opinion, clearly misinterpreted the requirement and didn't notice. So actually, he actually pointed out that he's impressed with the evidence or whatever, and this is the map he's talking about. But in my opinion, it just brings up more questions than answers because the vantage point is completely off from where it should have been. And as far as the number of buildings over 4 stories, I believe the hearing examiner was correct, or clearly erroneous, because in his comments, it says, if you read them on his finding, it says the vast majority of references in the application say 5 buildings, not 4. That's not true. Vast majority means 51% or greater. If you look at the application, it references at least 5 times that there will be 4 buildings. I see it only 2 places that there are going to be 5 buildings. 5 references versus 2 references, that's not the vast majority. As far as I remember from, I'm not very smart, but vast majority doesn't mean 20%. It means the great, more than. So I believe that he was incorrect in that. And if we could go to the application, go, if you would, toward the end where Exhibit E, if you can find that. It's like 3/4 the way through toward the end.
Stop. Where are we?
Okay. Go up a little bit, please. E, keep going. Up, up, up.
Mr. Babcock,
Okay.
you might want to make your
Yeah.
point before the slide comes up. You're going to run out of
Okay.
time.
So the sight line right here, this graphic, if you look closely, it depicts where they did the study. They did the study right here. Study should have been done over here. And those are the sight lines right there. And can I have...
Just if you could, yeah, like a sentence, at most 2, to wrap up your thoughts.
Okay. Can, all right. And if the council members look at the next few drawings in the application, you'll see that 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings are shown as 4 stories. These are all 3 stories. Even the illustrations of elevations show 4 stories, 4 buildings of 4 stories, not 5. So in my opinion, the hearing examiner was clearly erroneous in saying the vast majority of the references were 5 stories. It's simply not true if you look at the application carefully. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Babcock. Okay, so at this time, we're going to turn it over for council decision or discussion. Discussion, council, any questions?
I have a clarifying question. I'm not sure who of whom. From based on what I saw, the omitted building in the uncorrected application was Building K. Building K is approximately 29.5 feet lower than the 4 that were not omitted, making it, by definition, at least 2 stories lower than the buildings that were not omitted, right? And my point here is okay, it was omitted, but it's the lowest building on the property and should have the least amount of impact on any 4-story discussion.
That's correct.
Did I read the map correctly?
That's correct.
Okay.
I was going to ask Bob Sturbank to explain an option available to the council if they so choose.
Yes, and the council may have a closed session with legal counsel if it wants to ask questions of me or any of each other. As a quasi-judicial body, the Open Meetings Act is clear that it does not apply to that portion of the meetings or deliberation of a quasi-judicial body hearing a quasi-judicial matter. So that's an option available to council either now or after you go through questions if you'd like, or if you want to proceed straight to deliberations here and during the open session, that is your prerogative also.
Councilmember Stonewall.
So I'm curious, and again, I don't know if the people who made the statements are allowed to respond, or because my question may not be able to be answered by somebody at this table. So I don't know the procedure.
Ask the question.
I'll ask the question. Here we go. So Mr. Babcock had on numerous occasions, at least half a dozen times in the last 10 minutes, referenced sight lines should have been taken from here, should have been taken from there. And I'm just curious, I'm not an engineer. This looks really awesome. Like, this looks like there was time and math put into this. And so I'm just curious as to what grounds on which Mr. Babcock is claiming that this artwork here was done incorrectly, based on what professional or other?
Up to the city attorney.
Okay.
What I heard said several times was the argument that section 4.6.1 of the mixed-use final plan, which is the operative section that talks about two to three stories versus 4 to 5, refers to the vantage point of the highest point on the site. And if if you actually look at the language, it doesn't say highest, it says higher. And if I can just find...
On-site would not be any of the parcels in question where there are single-family homes. That's not on-site, correct?
Correct. But so the language, he said that that you should go to the highest, then he gave you the elevation because that was the highest point. But the language actually talks about such that the apparent, and I'm quoting here, quote, such that the apparent height from the higher of elevation on the site does not give the appearance of a structure in excess of 2 to 3 stories, etc. So the language of the condition does not say highest.
And from my vantage point, if FF, does FF stand for like ground level? Finished floor. So the lowest finished floor is the highest finished floor is 1085.8. So is that the point from which, then that's on site, obviously, is that the point from which we should be measuring everything else?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I...
No, there's more site north of the highest finished floor. There's a retaining wall and then a landscape area. So if it's the higher point, I would view that as the uphill property line, not the highest finished floor.
So can you give me a number? What's the number we should be operating off?
The higher portion of the site at the property line is somewhere near 1088. You are correct.
And so all vantage points need to come from that point.
Well, the criteria is not that specific. There's no formula, and so we weigh the evidence. Staff agreed with it. We drafted findings as such, and the hearing examiner reviewed all the information and adopted staff's findings. So in essence, agreed with staff's interpretation of higher point of the site.
Right. All of the, I guess it's northerly and northwesterly boundary of the site is higher than the locations where the 4-story buildings are. And there were various, as it was explained, vantage points where those sight lines were shot essentially from the uphill property boundary of the site, which are higher than the remainder of the site. Councilmember Lasay,
I was just going to get into the conversation because it does say higher point on the site. That could pertain to any particular location that happens to be higher than another one. It could mean the northeast corner at 1070 is higher than the lower corner at 1042. It's a higher portion of the site, so it really applies to any portion that is higher. You do a sightline study from to determine, and I believe they did 3 different sightline studies to address those indications. It seems to be clear in that sense. Okay. They studied the higher side.
I'm sorry, Mr. Babcock, I can't have you. No, Mr. Babcock, you can't comment at this time because this is the council deliberating, so, yeah, sorry. Councilmember Holloway?
So, in the resolution, it states the section 4.6.1 SR2 mixed-use final plan. Working down into that, it states
Councilmember Holloway, could you pull the microphone closer?
where the proposed building design so that the portion of the structure with a height in excess of 3 stories is less than 50% of the total structure. Can you give me interpretation of what that means?
I believe you're in the draft resolution, and I don't know which page of 6.
I'm in page 1 of 6.
1 of 6, thank you.
Fourth whereas.
Yeah, I have it underlined, thank you.
It's also page 26 of findings of facts.
Right. Of the hearing examiner's decision.
That's correct.
Is that individual structures or the structures collectively, and is that the height?
If the criteria were more specific to give staff more formula to work with, we would have used it. And so we use generally accepted practices. They gave all the relevant topography shots, 3 line of sight sections that I had in my PowerPoint, and based on that information, we made that finding. And
so I concur that we've met is designed in a fashion to minimize bulk scale of 4-story buildings, such that we've used topography, we've used welling the buildings and all that. My question, and maybe this is a question to you, Bob, I'm not sure we've met the 3 stories or less than 50% of the structure.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And is that even in scope?
Yeah, the next stage is mixed-use consistency review, and that's the final drawings. They can't get there without this conditional use permit approval action, because as shown, if this action is not affirmed, they can't have 4 stories and would have to redesign. If this is affirmed, then they would go through mixed-use consistency review, whereas those sheets would be much more detailed and show that 50% in a calculation, and staff would verify it as a finding of mixed-use consistency review for that specific portion of that finding.
Okay, so in that 50% of the elevation for that structure has to be less than 3 stories.
Exactly. But what you have in the record and in the hearing examiner's action is testimony that it meets it. What you don't have is the exact formula and the exact drawing for mixed-use consistency review, proving to staff administratively that each building meets that. Let's say the drawings that you are shown to make this finding are then submitted for mixed-use consistency review, and one of those 5 buildings shows 51%, they will not get mixed-use consistency review approval.
Okay, that's a future item, but it also says contingent on this mixed use. Let me get back to it.
Councilmember Sundwall, I'll get you in a moment.
And just as a reminder, so it actually needs to be flipped around so that the decision needs to be affirmed unless there's evidence in the record that shows this we're talking about finding 111 on page 26, where the examiner finds that this section 4.6.1 is met. So you would need to find that finding is clearly erroneous.
So, and I'm asking for evidence that 50% of the total structure is less than 3 stories.
Is less than 4 stories.
No, I think he's correct. The appearance.
Stories.
It says.
Portion of the structure with a height in excess of 3 stories is less than 50% of the total structure.
Read the 4-story is less than 50%. So the portion with the portion of the structure with a height in excess of 3 stories, that's the 4-story.
Right. So if you have a 4-story building, the top story is 25%
You're saying,
of
well, that was my original question. That you're saying that 50% is a height measurement, not a area measurement of the building. That 50% of the area of the roof needs to be less than 3 stories.
Okay. Councilmember Sundwall, are you asking a clarifying question on this item, or you have a different subject matter?
It's on this. I think I get it. So, because my thought is I saw drawings of the entire unit being 4 stories. When I read this, I thought it had to be tiered so that 50% of the building had to be 3 stories or less. But what it's saying is that is designed so the portion of the structure that is in excess of 3 stories, meaning the 4th story, is less than 50% of the total structure. I don't, unless you had a like
Math doesn't add up.
Yeah, it doesn't. Unless you had a reverse pyramid structure, I don't know how that would ever be true. How untrue.
We have the applicant here that could easily provide the testimony he gave to the hearing examiner on that topic.
But just imagine an 8-story building. The number of stories above 3 would be
Councilmember Mayhew?
50%. I think that's
Yeah.
what it's getting at. That sort of a concept.
Would the
It's not
council like to hear?
presupposing that
Would the
4 is
council like to hear for
maximum.
clarification from the applicant?
I think I've got it.
All right.
And I would also, refer the council to findings 114 and 115 on page 27 of the examiner's decision.
But I'd like to add one comment, Mr.
Which
Mayor,
is-
if
I'll get you in 1 second.
And I guess the most pertinent portion of that is in 114, where the examiner concludes that no one opposing the project presented any credible evidence, testimony, or studies that would rebut the staff analysis that showed that it would be less than 50%. So that's that on that particular point.
Councilmember Lassay.
So my clarifying question is really about the scope of our review. The scope of our review is what's being appealed. And I'd like maybe a short statement on what is really being appealed. Is it the 4th story, or is it the appearance of 50% of the bulk, or is it the number of units? I'd like just a quick clarification on that. What is being appealed, so it's clear?
Let me try
So
to
we don't
take-
get out of our boundaries here.
Right, take that at several levels. They're appealing the conditional use permit. Conditional use permit addresses 4 stories versus 2 or 3, and is governed by that section 4.6.1, which includes all the language we were just talking about, and is subject to the code requirement that in order to be reversed, or actually, let me rephrase that it shall be affirmed unless the council concludes that the hearing examiner's findings and conclusions are clearly erroneous.
So if I
So there are those criteria. Layered on that are the examiner's review findings and conclusions concerning the general conditional use permit criteria that are contained in, I want to say, chapter 17.
17.55030.
Yeah, correct.
So
That's what's in front of you.
as a clarification then, so it's the decision criteria are based upon those 5 items. Our decision is based upon analysis of those 5 items, and if we find that the hearing examiner has erred in application of those 5 items in any way, then that would be grounds for not, so but it's based upon the evidence that's been presented.
Correct.
In a substantial.
Councilmember Holloway.
Substantial way, not any.
Right.
Right, and it's,
There's a
yeah, with
burden
the
of
evidence,
here.
with the evidence presented.
So, Bob, what sections are we referring to in regards to the 50%?
So the findings, well, the 50% language appears in section 4.6.1 of the mixed-use final plan. It's quoted in the examiner finding 111 on page 26 of his decision. And then also, if you turn the page to page 27, finding 114 and 115. And these pertain specifically to the findings that the proposal meets the criteria for conditional use permit, and that's his heading on page 26.
Councilmember Sunwell.
So, Bob, there's a lot here, so I'm just looking for a way to simplify, and I think Matt was attempting the same. So is it oversimplifying to suggest that, other than looking at the evidence and how they apply to these 5 things, that the conditional use permit criteria, as explained in Holly Fletcher's on page 3 of her appeal, that those are the 5 things we have to focus on?
I believe those are the exact same 5 things that are on page 3.
They're
of
not, I think she
34.
referenced them.
Yeah,
But so are those the 5 things solely that we have to base our discussion on, and any evidence that pertains to them, of course, we would apply? But is it that simple?
Well, it's
Help me.
it's those 5 things plus section 4.6.1, which pertains specifically to the 4 to 5 stories versus 2 to 3. Again, that paragraph that is quoted in finding 111, it's quoted in the 4th whereas on the front page of the resolution. Councilmember Holloway was asking about. It's quoted in a number of different places in the decision document.
In the staff report, the advisory report, the key finding is 4.6.1 of the mixed-use final plan in regard to 4th and 5th story elements. That's the finding that's most relevant. But in the Snoqualmie Municipal Code, there are these 5 findings for regular conditional use permits, for instance, downtown. And so in the staff advisory report, we included both because it is a conditional use permit.
But does, ironically...
Council, just one reminder, yeah, just so nobody doesn't start talking over each other and having conversations, if you could just be recognized by the chair. Councilmember Summer.
So then, is it fair to say then, can you have a situation in which we agree or disagree on for whatever, that 50% paragraph, and actually the conditional use permit criteria have nothing to do with this appeal? That's actually a question for Bob.
I'm not sure.
So what I'm saying is the ruling that the examiner came up with was based on the I'll have that memorized by 4.6.1. Does the code have anything to do with his decision? In other words, we might like to get warm and fuzzy with the fact that it might fit the 5 things we've come up with in a code, but does our code actually have anything to do? Could we find flaws in 1 through 5 and still not be able to overturn his decision?
Well, the specific criteria is section 4.6.1. And there's a long line of appellate case law that says when you have sort of competing, potentially applicable rules, the specific controls over the general. And so one approach the council could take is to conclude that section 4.6.1 is what applies, and
the warm and fuzzies of the code.
And 17.55.030 don't, because they're the more general. And this 4.6.1 is what applies to SR2 mixed-use final plan.
Would it put us in legal jeopardy if we ignored 1 through 5?
Well, I'm going to stop.
Just let me just finish.
Those are questions you
That's
ask in
questions that we
executive
should ask.
Right.
Yes, I get it. Thank you.
The examiner also finds and concludes in finding 117 that all of the 5 criteria in 17.55.030 are also met. And that's laid out here at some length. And so, again, where the appellants might disagree or someone might quibble with some aspect or the other, the legal standard is you have to affirm unless you find that it's clearly erroneous, considering the record as a whole.
And just to say on the clarification method then, it's not a matter of our opinion, it's a matter of the facts presented in the hearing and on appeal and in the hearing examiner's decision, whether we believe that criteria to be too general or too specific or not. It's a matter of was it presented and was it properly argued that that burden of proof was met.
Correct.
Is that a correct statement?
Yes.
Thank you. Now I know how I can start with that.
Councilmember Jeans, Ross, Mayhew, we haven't heard much from you. Just want to give an opportunity. So,
I'm good.
all right.
I think it's been clarified.
Okay. Is there any other discussion, council?
I'm going to take another whack at this because I want to make sure this is completely defensible.
Councilmember Somo.
So the fact that he references those 5 items in his decision, does that require us to affirm his statement that these are all met in addition to 4.6.1? Am I making myself clear? Because he referenced these 5 criteria in his decision. And if I have to go through these 5 criteria, that's a decision that's going to take a little longer than 4.6.1 for me.
And maybe that's a conversation that council might want to have in a closed session.
Okay. If I'm the only one that has that, then carry on. But if that's a concern to anybody else, we may want to break for that. unless everyone's comfortable with those things, 5 things being met, then it's not an issue.
All right, Councilman Mayhew?
I have a couple several related questions on a path here. My first question is, if we believe that the hearing examiner omitted a finding that is relevant or necessary, can we ask for that to be supplemented before we make a decision?
Record?
Yeah, it isn't on the record. Mayor, I think I would recommend that the council recess into executive session if we're going to get into a deep dive about
All right.
legal questions any further than we've already gone.
Okay, so why don't we do that?
I suggest you go to the lunchroom because Peggy's upstairs.
So at this time, the council is going to go into executive session pursuant to RCW 42.30, Section 140, Section 2, to allow council consideration or deliberation on a quasi-judicial land use matter and a possible All right. Meeting's back in session.
I love this map.
Council, any further discussion? If there's no further discussion, is there anyone who'd like to make a motion?
Mayor, I'd like to make a motion. I move to adopt Resolution 1439, affirming the findings, conclusions, and decision of the Snoqualmie hearing examiner, approving a proposed conditional use permit, CUP 17-0002, for panorama apartment projects on parcel S20 in the Snoqualmie Ridge 2 community, providing for severability and an effective date.
Second.
All right. Motion and a second is stated by Councilmember Mayhew to approve Agenda Bill 18044. Any discussion, Council?
I guess I would just say I share some of the concerns that Mr. Babcock and Mrs. Fletcher have stated here. But given the very, very narrow grounds that we have to rule on tonight, I can't, a lot of that just can't factor into my decision. The good news, I think, is that even as if this is approved, as we go through design review, I think there are opportunities to make sure that some of the issues that have been brought up by Holly and Adam can be addressed. I'm not suggesting that it's going to eliminate a fourth floor, but I do think there are opportunities to make sure that this does fit as perfectly as possible with the look and feel of our community. So, more to come on that.
Any other discussion, Council? See no further discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. All right, so thank you, Council. Are there being no further business to come before the